The premise of the Icarus syndrome is that, as in the myth of Icarus, in which the father, Daedalus, builds wings that prove very successful in achieving a certain task, which is getting them off the island of Crete, and the son flies those wings into the sun, not recognizing that they have limits. That American foreign policy tends to follow this similar pattern, in which success leads to people to overlearn the lessons of that success and breeds hubris, and then ultimately leads to disaster, as in Icarus flying the wings that his father had built into the sun. Well, I particularly talk about three. The first is America's entrance into World War I and the kind of vision that Woodrow Wilson had of an international system that could be like American domestic politics, in which different countries would relate to one another under the rubric of law and reason rather than of arbitrary power, as individual Americans did, not by resolving their conflicts by force, but through elections and by appealing to judges. The second is America's entrance into Vietnam, the idea that essentially America could stop the march of communism in every country around the world, with this image that we were essentially replaying the struggle against Hitler again and again and again. And the third is what I call the hubris of dominance, which is essentially the sense that led up to the Iraq War, that America had in its power to essentially turn hostile regimes into ideologically sympathetic allies, and thus kind of gradually move towards the American domination of every strategically important region on the earth. I think the drama of American foreign policy right now is, I think, that the drama of the Obama administration trying to face up to the reality of limits, and limits of public will to continue to prosecute the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, massive new financial limits that are starting to emerge, even the limits to some degree of the American model ideologically, but in a political environment in which talking openly about those limits is very politically precarious. And I think that the drama, much of Obama's foreign policy, is trying to essentially learn to live with those limits without coming to be seen as the embodiment of national weakness and decline. Well, there's no mathematical formula for it. You know, it's a little bit like the stock market. How do you know when the stock market is peaked and that it's time that things are about to go south? I do think that you are better equipped to make those decisions if you have a kind of rich understanding of the particular country in which you're contemplating some kind of intervention with at that time. America, if you look at America's wars in Iraq and Vietnam, one of the striking things is how little that the people who were in charge of American foreign policy understood about those countries, and therefore their willingness to take analogies drawn from very different parts of the world and apply them to those countries. Hubris is born from success. So, I mean, the question of whether there will be another cycle of hubris, I think, has a lot to do with whether America will have another cycle of economic, military, and ideological success, such that people tend to be very confident in America's military's ability to win wars, in economic resources being virtually infinite, in the attractiveness of our ideological model. And I think it's a very open question today whether America will ever have the kind of self-confidence again that it had in, say, 1965 when we entered Vietnam in a big way, or in 2003 when the Iraq War started. The circumstances are particularly grim today. You have an Israeli government that I think really has very little interest in doing what it would take to create a Palestinian state. You have a Palestinian leadership that is very weak, and a Palestinian national movement that is divided between Hamas and Fatah. And so I think in those circumstances, you would not be too cynical to imagine that part of what the U.S. is doing is simply trying to create some peace talks, some sense of a process, because the alternative is very dangerous. I think right now the organized American Jewish community is a significant player in trying to prevent the Obama administration from putting pressure on the Netanyahu government to go further than they would want to go, for instance, in terms of renewing the settlement freeze, which is due to expire in September, or being willing to change some of Netanyahu's positions, like demanding the Palestinians not just recognize Israel, but recognize it as a Jewish state. So I think the American Jewish community is playing its traditional role, and I think not very constructive role in that regard. But I think if you look at the American Jewish population, I think there are significant shifts as younger American Jews, I think, become more distant from Israel, and I think less sympathetic to the idea that American Jews should not publicly voice their criticisms.